afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending today's MacEwan Celebrates Month of Scholarship presentation. I'm Dr. Craig Kazemski. I'm the Associate Vice President of Research, and I'm very thrilled to be the moderator for this event. I would like to begin this afternoon's event by acknowledging that the land on which we gather in Treaty 6 territory is the traditional gathering place for many Indigenous people. We honor and respect the history, languages, ceremonies, and culture of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who call this territory home. The First Peoples' connections to the land teaches us about our inherent responsibility to protect and respect Mother Earth. With this acknowledgement, we honor the ancestors and children who've been buried here, missing and murdered Indigenous women and men, and the process of ongoing collective healing for all human beings. We are reminded that we are all treaty people and of the responsibility we have to one another. So again, welcome to the final faculty research and scholarly activity presentation in our month-long celebration of MacEwan Scholarship. And we've had 8 outstanding talks so far. You remember back on April 1st, we started with Val McLean, who did a really nice talk on the history of MacEwan University. And I think that was a great way to show us where we've came from. And then I think the 7 talks since then, and I know Dean Costen will likely contribute to that very well today, helps us to see, kind of where we are and I think where we can go into the future. So I'm very excited and very honored to be able to introduce today's speaker, Dean Wanda Costen, or Dr. Wanda Costen, our Dean of the School of Business, and her talk on partnerships with community members and external funding opportunities. And it's a very timely talk, as MacEwan has long had a reputation as being a community engaged university. That's one of our organizational pillars. But I think sometimes we really want to ask ourselves, okay, we say we're community engaged, we say we're a community outreach type of organization. Well, what does that really mean? And we want to make sure our engagement is meaningful. And if you happen to look at some of the highlights in the federal budget that came out on Tuesday, there are some really good opportunities for MacEwan in there that I think really speak to some of the excellence that we have in-house. And I think one of the most significant ones that really stood out for me was $12 million was allocated starting this year over the next 3 years by SSHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, to fund what they call academic research into systemic barriers facing diverse groups. And again, as we think about community engagement and not just doing community engaged research to say we did it, but actually how do we make sure that we're best collaborating and best working with community partners to try and solve pressing societal issues. I think that funding is something that really speaks to some of the excellence that MacEwan has. So on one housekeeping note, before I turn it over to Dr. Costen, if you have questions, please ask them to me in the chat function, and I'll address them during the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So I would now like to welcome and turn the podium over to Dr. Costen.
Sorry about that. I needed to unmute before I started sharing the screen because then I couldn't see the unmute button. So okay, so just to start, really what I'm talking about here is trying to understand the relationships that we already have and how those relationships can actually lead to external funding. So that's really what I'm going to talk about today. It's not the traditional type of a research presentation that I'm used to giving. It's really sharing some experiences and perhaps piquing your interest in thinking of different ways instead of the traditional, let's apply to a bunch of external federal, provincial government grants, etc. So first, much as you said, as our esteemed colleague Craig said here, this is really part of who we are as a university, right? One of the things we talk about all the time with MacEwan is the fact that we are embedded and connected to the community. I always say that we border 104 and 105, and those are very distinctly different constituencies. So we really have to think about how do we do that? How do we engage? Now, this literally comes from our own website. in terms of who MacEwan is and what we're about. And I talk about it all the time in terms of what distinguishes MacEwan from other post-secondary institutions. And you'll see it here. It's this engagement with the community. I also like the second bullet here, which talks about our research really being focused on local and global questions and how do we enhance the quality of what happens in Edmonton. And I mean that for real. I mean, I'm not really talking about let's hold hands, sing kumbaya. I really am talking about how do we take the work that we do, the experiences that we've had, and move them forward to address issues that we see in our city. So for me, what's our role as a scholar? My faculty colleagues are used to me talking about this, that we must remember that at the end of the day, we are scholars. And that can take many different forms. For many of us who are type 1, that's the traditional research that we see. But certainly in the School of Business, because we're a professional school, we talk openly and regularly about the wide array of outcomes that are acceptable for us as we think about what it means to do research in the School of Business. But there's a couple of things I want to call to mind. Our role is actually to bring these talents, these skills that we have, to bear to solve and address social issues. I think, and perhaps it's particular to who Alberta is and how it evolved, but I think it's important for people to understand who are scholars, who are faculty, and how can they help the city. Many of us have heard this term about the ivory tower. That's not who we are. We are engaged with, side by side with, all of our community members. And being a liaison shifts our thinking in that we are bringing an academic perspective, our academic analytical skills, and these competencies to bear in sectors that are not directly tied to us. So it's an opportunity for us to show how we can contribute, how can we work with others to address these issues. It's also an interesting way for us to take theories. Most of y'all know I'm a sociologist. So how do I take my sociological theories and my methodological analytical skills to really solve issues that are plaguing society? Almost everything that is a problem or a concern for the city of Edmonton or the province of Alberta can be addressed through academic research. We just have to be able to bridge that gap and build relationships in a way where it's not us talking down to our colleagues and our partners, but how do we work together and how do we help them see that this perspective that we have gives them access to a different way and approach to solving problems. So what's required? I always say first and foremost, you have to understand how one's own research impacts society, not just because we're doing the research. That's important, don't get me wrong. But it's really about how do what we know to do, how do these experiences and expertise, how does that work within an organization to help move it forward? That's really critical. And often I find academics are used to talking to other academics and are less skilled, less comfortable explaining what we do to those who are not academics. When I was in grad school, one of my favorite professors said, Wanda, you really know what you're doing when you can explain what you're doing to a 12-year-old. Like you should be able to explain your research project to a 12-year-old. And if we can do that, then we can get people to understand like, oh, wow, I understand that. So I'll just give a short example. When I went to grad school and I left business, I had no clue what I was getting into, clearly, because had I known, I probably wouldn't have a PhD today. Like, who would knowingly do that, right? So when people asked me what I wanted to study or what I wanted to do, what I wanted to research, because that's how we talk, right? I was like, well, I don't really know about all that, but I can tell you this. I want to understand why there aren't more people who look like me in positions of power and authority in business. That's what I told people. Well, who doesn't understand that? Everybody understood that. Now, I could tell you, it obviously got framed quite differently as the research question for my dissertation, but everybody understands what I just said and could say, oh, wow, okay, I can see that. And then to say, how does my sociological theories help me address and answer those questions. And then what methodologies might I be using as statistical analyses to get some answers to that question, right? So that's what I mean about understanding how your own research can impact society, but through these organizations that you partner with. I think it also stems from a willingness to do outreach and connect with the community, which is what we do all the time in MacEwan. It's how do you leverage that, right? How do you partner with folks? I will tell you that the two major partnerships that we've built in the School of Business that have not intentionally turned into major grant proposals for federal funding that is related to Black entrepreneurship. This is huge. The cool thing is I didn't go to them. They came to me because I was already engaged with them in a variety of ways. And when they saw the opportunity to do this funding that was related to Black entrepreneurship, they actually didn't think about the U of A. They thought about MacEwan, and this is what they said to me. You have been a supporter, you've been a keynote lecturer, a guest speaker, you promote us, you're always available, you always say yes. So when we think about who we want to work with as a PSI to address this issue that we think is real and meaningful, we called MacEwan. And we're particularly calling you to see if you can help us do that. And then my job as the dean was just to identify some of my faculty colleagues who had a research background and agenda that could lend itself to answering or providing the research to deliver the outcomes expected from the external grant. So it starts with building these relationships well in advance. So I invite you to also start thinking about right now, what are some of the organizations that I currently already work with and partner with, and what kinds of funding might be available to leverage that partnership to move forward to address a particular phenomenon. Where are some of the opportunities? I learned this quite candidly as a young, not yet tenured, assistant professor who was being tasked because of my business background to do a bunch of consulting projects. And of course, initially, certainly in the United States, I wasn't making the kind of money our assistant professors are making, I can tell you that. But that meant that I was teaching in the summer, right, for additional funds, and I was doing consulting wherever I could. And then at a certain point, a light bulb switched for me, which was, wait a minute, do I really need the money or do I need the funding? Like, do I personally, Wanda Costen, need the money, like as part of my income? Or do I need the funding to do some cool research, right? And that's when I started taking some of my consulting projects that I could identify would result in data gathered and experiences that could be published. And when I identified those, I asked the organizations, they were business organizations, if they would be okay with submitting a sponsored project with funding attached to it through the Office of Research. And that was a game changer for me because that now gave me access to this data that I could publish off of, not just from a perspective of I'm going to gather this data, I'm going to give them an action plan and a report, and I'm going to move on with my money. It was bigger than that for me in terms of developing me as a scholar. So as a result, always, always, always ask permission to use the data and remind them that ethically we're responsible for ensuring no one can determine who they are as an organization. Now, what you'll find is some organizations, depending on the outcome, will want themselves identified because it will look good for them, right? Other times they won't. But I always ask for permission to use the data. Similarly, always get RAB approval, even if they go, well, you don't really need that approval. No, but I want you to look over my methodology. I want you to look at all these different pieces that I'm going to be doing and make sure you don't have any ethics issues. Because then I can publish off of that data, even if I don't think I'm going to be publishing off that data. Okay, so next we have to think about partnering. What does this look like? They can open doors for us, particularly because a lot of folks are willing to give funding to nonprofits to address certain issues. This, however, does require you to educate, train, coach your partners. And it may require some shared ownership of the outcomes. It may require you to tweak what it is you really want to do and get them bought in on how this project is going to help them in the long term, and then how you're going to use this data in new and different ways to help you as well and progress along your role as an academic. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to slip through this next slide because it looks like I have a slide from another project that it shouldn't be in here, but this is what happens when you don't pay attention to what you're doing. So that's me. I think there are plenty of opportunities, and you're probably not thinking about partnerships and relationships that you have right now that would potentially yield funding to do really fun and interesting research that you care about, but would have the dual purpose of addressing some social issues, concerns, especially in business issues that need to be addressed, and how you can bring to bear theory, thereby educating people that are not academics in the value of what we do every day, that we're not just preaching to the ivory tower. So I'm going to stop sharing so I can see y'all, and feel free to ask any questions.
Okay. Thank you, Dean Costen. So I will monitor the chat. So if anybody has any questions, please just put them into the chat, and I can, if it's a small question, I can just relay it to Dr. Costen, or I can also unmute you and you can ask your question directly. So we had one initial question, I think, while you were speaking. They wondered if some of the notes, if we can make the notes, or I guess some version of them, available to people.
Yeah, sure. I don't have any problem with that. I can send this to y'all for distribution for whoever would like it, of course. I would also say, obviously, folks are aware that I'm going to be departing MacEwan, but I'm literally just an email away. So I'm also happy to talk with folks one-on-one about projects that they're thinking and helping them identify other partners, community partners who could join with them on that, and identifying other ways to identify funding that might be related to what they want to study and what they want to do. I will say I'm aware that this particular government is really enamored with what we call P3 partnerships, public-private partnerships, plus partnering with the PSI. So that's really something this particular government is interested in. And so anytime that you can partner with a non-academic entity, and especially a private partner, that's really special there. You're likely to be able to get some funds from that.
Let me start things off, then I'll throw out a question to you. Like, I mean, a message that I've always tried to give people is, I think when you work with community partners, when you want to collaborate with them on a study, not study them, because that's somewhat insulting. You know, now that community partnerships, you know, all of a sudden they have a lot more value, because you look at a lot of the tri-agency grants, you know, I'm sure Cancer Against CHR, you know, a lot of them will specify, you know, you won't get this particular funding unless you actually have, you know, either they call it a knowledge user or an active community partner as one of your actual research partners. And I think one thing that I worry about is, I mean, community partners have for a long time wanted to be involved in studies. And I think at times, I think, you know, a lot of academics, probably myself included at times, was guilty of this. We tended to go to community partners when we needed them. So we needed to get funding. We wanted to create a partnership. And I think that's really something we have to make sure that we don't do. Like, we have to be sincere, and we have to recognize that we can't only go after people for data or other research collaborations when it's timely or when we need it. I mean, we have to recognize this is a bit of a commitment, and there has to be sort of an ongoing nurturing and maintenance of a relationship in that.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's why I started with, I would always recommend that you think about the organizations you're already working with. Many people, if not most, at MacEwan, and you do it because of who you are and who MacEwan is, and the fabulous faculty that we have. But one of the things we spend a lot of time talking about in the School of Business is, let's remember that service isn't just service to the School of Business. It's also service to your profession. It's service to the community at large. And so many of us are doing all kinds of activities. We're guest speakers at events. We're mentoring. We're engaged with folks who really are addressing some big issues in the city or the province. And it doesn't occur to us that some of the challenges they're having, we can help them address. And I think the biggest challenge, at least for me, the biggest challenge is always help them to understand this is how research works. This is where theories come from. And then sometimes it's, and I don't mean this disparagingly, but sometimes it's almost like teaching, right? That you have to break down these big theories and show them how the theories are enacted in real life and practice, and show how why the benefit you bring is this knowledge. And by collecting this data and partnering with them, you're going to analyze this data to help them solve a problem. So I'll use an example. This is one of my favorite examples. As a young, not in age, as a junior faculty member, I was fortunate to partner. It's called the Bureau of Reclamation in Nevada, Boulder City. And actually, they basically run the Hoover Dam. They run the Hoover Dam. One of the benefits I got was to tour the behind the scenes of the Hoover Dam. Let me just tell you, that was worth everything to me to see behind the scenes of the Hoover Dam. Just overwhelmingly blew my mind. But the person I met, and we were colleagues on some nonprofit experience where I think I'd come in and done some presentation. And she said, look, can we talk? And of course, went to coffee. And she said, look, here's our issue. She was in HR. I come from HR. And she said, look, we got an issue. And this is the United States government. So there's lots of information there about Equal Employment Opportunity Office. There's a lot of data that's got to get collected in the United States if you work anything related to the government to ensure equity and diversity. And she said, here's what we're discovering. We seem to be incapable of hiring diverse people. And of course, I'm like, yeah, right. That is not impossible, right? It happens every day in business. But this was the federal government. And her point was, we have all these rules and regulations, and somehow we still keep hiring white guys. And I said, well, what does the pool look like? She goes, well, that's why we're stuck. The pool of candidates from which to select is diverse. And yet every single time we're putting in a requisition to hire someone, the candidate of choice is a white male. What is going on? Well, of course, all my sociological bells are going off, like, I can tell you what's going on. Barriers to entry, all kinds of stuff. But I'm thinking like a sociologist. So I had to convert that terminology into regular speak to her to say, here's what I think is probably going on. But I don't know, I need to conduct a study. She goes, a study? And of course I said, well, how about this? What you're talking about is identifying barriers to hiring diverse people because you want a diverse workforce. And you don't understand what's happening because you have a diverse pool of candidates. So I said, why don't we call it a barrier analysis? She's like, okay. So I literally got them, I'm a qualitative researcher for the most part. I actually got them to give me access to a variety of people up and down the food chain to understand, one, the selection process, the recruitment process. It was very specific because they had all these rules and regulations about who's qualified and then how these decisions were made. I actually did face-to-face 1-hour interviews with these folks and then wrote a small grant inside, hence where I get the term seed grant. Got a seed grant to hire a student to help me with transcription and coding. And lo and behold, I produced an entire report that 5 years later they were still using to help them understand. It totally transformed their search process, their selection process. It created training. And 5 years later, they were making these changes. Now, the irony is, over a decade later, she reached out to me and said, believe it or not, we're ready for phase 2. And they invited me back. Well, now I'm an associate professor. I'm some bigwig at the University of Tennessee. This is my area of research. And when I walked in the room, they were like, wow, there's really a Costen, because they had shortened all of that to the Costen report. Like, I'm like, oh my God, that's a little scary. But they had been using that material and that information to improve their processes. And now they had a very diverse work group. And of course, because I had thought in advance, like, oh, this is right up my alley, I had taken that same data and published it, right? So I was able to serve the academic side of my life and give back to an organization who needed help, really just to understand what was at play and what was going on. And it was all sociology. And then it didn't hurt that I had an HR background, so I could use HR lingo to talk to the HR folks and all these individuals about what was going on in their actual business. So that's what I mean about just being open and having to sometimes explain things differently because everybody's not an academic, and most certainly they're not academics in our particular disciplines.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for that. So we've had a question that came in. Somebody asked a question about the Black Entrepreneurship Project, how it all started. How did you convince them to want to do the project? And, what were some of the challenges you might have experienced in just getting it kind of up and going?
Yeah, it started because they came to me, to be honest with you. One is the Diversity Awards. I met Franklin, I want to say 2.5 years ago, and he had heard some presentation I did. I can't remember where. I belong to EBDN, which is the Edmonton Business Diversity Network, and he had heard me do a presentation there, and then reached out to me and said, "Would you be our keynote for the Diversity Awards in Edmonton?" I'm like, "Okay, didn't know there were Diversity Awards, but sure, I'll come." And that started our relationship, to be honest with you. And when he heard that there was funding available for a Black entrepreneurship ecosystem in Canada, he literally sent me an email and said, "I know this is in your wheelhouse. I know this is your kind of research. We want to partner with you. Will you be the post-secondary institute that works with us on this project?" Yeah, sure will. So they had to do the submission, but I provided some support for him, got a letter from the president saying, absolutely, this is how MacEwan will play a role in developing this ecosystem. The second one was Black Canadian women, who, again, I was invited 2 years ago to be their keynote speaker for Women's Month, which follows Black History Month. And they were so enamored with the experience that they also invited me to participate regularly in their board meetings and to provide them insight on how they could get more engagement and training and coaching for these immigrants who were entrepreneurs but couldn't find jobs in Canada because, as you know, in Canada, you got to have Canadian experience for some reason, right? And when she found out about this, there was a request for the Black Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, which clearly was about identifying, collecting data, analyzing data to uncover, one, how big is that population? What barriers are they facing? What resources do they need? Well, that's just a research project, right? So the hardest part with that one was bringing in this collective of folks who are not academically oriented and having them share their ideas on what they wanted to do as an outcome of that. What kinds of activities and support and training and resources would this Black Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub provide? And then my role was as an academic to say, yeah, but you see over here, they actually want some analyses conducted, right? And here's how we're going to do that. Here's how we're going to gather the data. Here's how we're going to do all these things. And then the tough part is writing the proposal, because we're quite academic. So I had them write pieces of the whole proposal and say, well, you focus on section 1 and 5. And then I reached out to my faculty colleagues who I knew had expertise or had demonstrated or indicated they were interested in some of these areas, and invited them to participate as a research group who would put forward and design the academic part, the research projects that were part of the whole system, right? And then I will tell you, Justine and I spent an entire evening and next day, because this thing was due at 3:15, and I'm not kidding you, we sent it to our partner at 3:12, and thankfully it got uploaded by 3:15, because it literally was all hands on deck, fine tuning. many of these federal projects, you only have a certain amount of time and space, right? 5 pages, whatever it is, and you got to pack it in there to make sure you're addressing all these key issues. And then you've got academics going, yeah, but Wanda, what about this? Folks, we'll get to that. But right now, we just got to figure out how do we get these 3 projects that align with what this Black Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub is going to be. How do we get that to fit in there? The next step is to go deeper into that, right? And how will the funding be? We had to craft a budget. So, I tasked my faculty colleagues who are good at this stuff to say, tell me how this money's going to get used over the next 3 years. What's it going to look like? How many research assistants are we going to need? Do we need databases? Whatever it is, right? So that's really how that came to be and where we are now. We submitted it on time. If I'm not mistaken, either sometime this month or next month, we'll begin to hear more about the degree to which we were successful with that. But I'll tell you what it did. It opened my mind, because what I realized is actually we can do some of that work right now. We have some funding in the Social Innovation Institute. We're doing some work around entrepreneurship, particularly Indigenous entrepreneurship in the School of Business. And we have some funds that we could use to launch some pilot projects to get this going now. We actually don't have to wait for the funding. So it's a good way also to shift your thinking and saying, I could actually do some of this now. And I actually encouraged my colleagues, I'm like, if you wrote a seed grant, that could actually be the first step of collecting data that would support this endeavor long term. So that's how that came to be, honestly.
So anyone else have any other questions or comments that they would like to pass on to Dr. Costen?
I just want to share how fun it is to look at a bunch of squares with names in it.
Yes, hopefully when we do this next year, it'll be in a hybrid format, and we will actually have faces on a campus in a classroom somewhere.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I know it's not a traditional research project, so there's probably not a lot of questions, and I do mean this. I'm open at any time. One of the things I like doing is creating opportunities for our faculty colleagues to be engaged and to do research that supports the endeavors. Some of our faculty colleagues have been engaged in creating a training module for Indigenous entrepreneurs. And now we're thinking about, we can gather data for everyone who goes through that project. It's a partnership with Alberta Indian Investment Corporation. And we built such a relationship that we can put together a pre and post test. We can put together a feedback survey, and we can start to collect data and track folks on their success after having gone through the training, the number of people who are able to launch some kind of an enterprise and make it viable and sustainable long term. So that's just another example of taking basically a training opportunity, a training program, and thinking of it differently and thinking of how we can collect data that will add value and contribute to the scholarship that we do every day.
Yeah. We had one kind of question that came in. Katherine Ryan, I'm going to unmute you. Do you want to ask your question? Because I wasn't quite sure. Oh, actually, I can unmute you, Katherine. You can ask Dr. Costen directly, because I wasn't quite sure how to interpret it from what you put in the text. I'll just unmute you.
I started my video. Hi. I brought my video on too. Nice to meet you.
Likewise.
Thanks so much for this. It's really exciting. Congratulations on all the excellent, amazing work. It's very inspiring. I'm actually, I was so excited to take this workshop because I'm not, as I said in my question, I don't have much business knowledge. I'm an artist, and I'm in the sessional instructor in the theater arts program, and been there for about 7 years, and really excited about, I just got accepted for a project grant through the MacEwan. So I'm so thrilled to build a project this summer in the community, utilizing Grant MacEwan's students, grads, past grads, to do a lot more community engagement, and basically it's building a review original work in Edmonton safely through COVID, and just kind of building bridges with communities and the arts. So and I guess my big question is, in terms of getting myself more educated, because this is something that I would love to be the beginning of a yearly venture that we can build with the students, the grads, or and offer other opportunities for collaborating with, bringing, even meeting artists to come into the program. So any workshops or information or resources that would be good for something like that would be awesome.
Yeah, I would say it depends on what you're trying to do. Anything works, to be honest with you, right? My colleagues know that I'm famous for, like, just try it, for goodness sake. How bad can it be? Just go do something, right? That's my new mantra. Just do something. So it really depends on what you want to do. I will say that there is a lot of money out there. Particularly, I would invite you to meet with Gillian in Careers and Experience. MyTax every single year has funding available to pay students to help with the variety of projects. And this is one that you could use. It also is related to work integrated learning, which is what this would be, right? Particularly in the theater arts. And I think this is a great way to show a variety of students from different backgrounds how you can work through the theater arts. Now, I'll tell you another just sidebar. I have regularly said to my fellow Dean Gilliland, I don't understand why your students aren't taking business classes, because at the end of the day, you're independent contractors and you're running your own business, right? In theory,
Exactly.
you're running, if you're an artist, it's your own business, literally. So we should be working together on these kinds of things, right? What does it mean to be an entrepreneur? That's your life. Literally, it's your life. So what kinds of things do I need to be aware of, right? So that's what I would say is, if you already have identified some partners, reaching out to them and saying, hey, we can't apply for the MyTax funding. The partner applies for the MyTax funding and then works with us to pay the student to do the work, right? Under your leadership, right? So whatever that looks like, if that's putting on a show, a theater show, right? At MacEwan, over there in Allard Hall, maybe it's even in the Roundhouse, physically distanced, wherever it is, you can get people to help you do that. And by people, I mean students, and there would be value in that, right? There's marketing students who want to be providing some input on promotions and how do we do that? Event planning, what does that look like? Design students, the organization of it all. How do we do outreach? Who gets to come in? What does that look? I mean, all those kinds of things happen.
Yes.
And of course, I'm just looking at it from the business side. You have the expertise on the talent management and the actual production of the art, right? That's not my world. So it can also open that up, right? For reaching out to all kinds of populations. I mean, I just had a wild thought, like, wow, wouldn't it be cool if we could bring in some of our vulnerable populations up and down 105 into MacEwan and have some kind of an art experience, and then do a show of that art experience that expresses their life? Wouldn't that be awesome? That's what I'm talking about, right?
And that's kind of what the premise of the show is it's called Scenes from the Sidewalk, and it's the artists connecting with the community and saying, we want to elevate your story. So that's awesome, Wanda.
Look at that, I was just winging it. Look at that. Okay, right. But that's what I mean, right? That is a great idea. And there's all sorts of people across campus, irrespective of the discipline or the particular faculty, who would love to be part of that. And it's part of, I was talking about this earlier today. It's part of what we mean by social innovation and social entrepreneurship and enterprises, right? There's a social aspect to who we are and what we do at MacEwan. And so every single discipline, every single faculty has the opportunity to impact the downtown community in this way, and to showcase our neighbors in ways that other institutions can't. And what better example than to bring our students into the fold and get them comfortable with our neighbors and recognize that when they go off into, we call it the real world in business, you have a responsibility to be a good corporate citizen and to invest in your community in real and meaningful ways. And art is an amazing mechanism to relieve all kinds and sorts of issues, right? So how do we get support for folks to do that? Like I saw Vazan on here before. He's an alum of the School of Business. Well, guess where he works? RBC. Yeah, write a check, help us out, and do this. No, I'm serious. RBC cares about this stuff. They really do. They care about how do we better prepare the next generation of workers. Although I will say one of my dear colleagues always says, Dr. Dean, we do a nice job of preparing employees. We should be preparing employers, right? So how do we help them develop these skills? And so when they go to work, they're challenging the status quo in their workplace on how that workplace can engage in the community. And that happens in events like what you're talking about. That's not just for theater arts students.
Right. That's excellent advice. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Yeah, and just, I know I commented at the beginning about the federal budget. I mean, one thing that was in the budget as well as they've allocated more money for, I think, both growth and expansion of the MyTax program. So I think, those types of opportunities, especially given that, as Dr. Costen said, it bridges industry with our students. I think they're outstanding partnerships, and those are the kind of things MacEwan we should be lining up to try and get applications into MyTax.
Absolutely. And I would also suggest, another plug for Jillian's crew, experiential learning. So I just came off of a call before I had to check in here, and it's with a group called Green Violin. They're part of Recover, and they're really working on a housing situation, affordable housing. And this partner is a developer. He is amazing. And we're talking about tiny homes, container homes, and vulnerable populations. I'm part of this Catalyst group. And we're talking about where would these neighborhoods be? What would they feel like? What would they look like? And because I was on this group and he was talking about how we have to use a different kind of a lease, right? And I'm like, what are you talking about? And he's like, well, we want to embed not that it's just the lease, but that there's a code of conduct attached to it. Like you have to conduct yourself in a certain way to remain in this community, even though it's only 8, container homes. And of course, immediately I thought of, well, heck, we have a property management minor. We have a paralegals program. We have a legal studies program. I'm like, well, why wouldn't you just hire some students to do that? And that's the kind of experience they need about what does this look like in the real world to make that happen? And he told me today in our meeting that he has literally identified 4 students who will be working on this project over the summer to literally create a lease, understanding the legal implications, and then writing a code of conduct within the lease. 4 students get to do that. That's amazing, right? So again, it's putting what they're learning in the classroom into practice, but it has a social aspect to it because it's to provide housing for a vulnerable population. So this is the kind of stuff we're talking about, right? They're going to have an experience that is going to blow their minds, right? So that's what we're thinking about.
All right, we got one more question. We had a question. How do you conceptualize community and/or community engaged scholarship? Again, it's one of those terms I think we use a lot, but I think people sometimes may just throw it out there thinking we're talking to people. Well, that may not quite be the gist of it, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think and then I can say this, there are certainly definitions, certainly Joanne's a fellow sociologist. So when we use the words community engaged scholarship, that has a specific definition, just like action research has a specific definition. I tend to be more broad in that, right? My concept of community is the folks with whom we engage every day. It's very broad. And because we're in downtown Edmonton, because I happen to be in the School of Business, community, and Joanne, you may have heard me say this, at the end of the day, I say we're providers of talent. And I don't care if that's not for profit, or government. That's what we're trying to do, And so we're trying to produce graduates who can add value in that way. So that's community to me. It's that broad. I also refer to community often because of our location. And I do talk about vulnerable populations, disenfranchised populations. And I believe the responsibility we have as MacEwan to engage with those neighbors and to help the greater Edmonton community understand their experiences and then work with the greater community to address their concerns. That's how we got partnered with Recover. That's how I got asked to be on the Catalyst group. That's how now I'm on a specific component of the Catalyst group that's looking at affordable housing for a variety of populations. Just by example, the population we're starting with right now happens to be dislocated. I just learned this term today. It's not homeless. Dislocated veterans. There are veterans in Edmonton who don't have a place to live on a regular basis. So how do we help? They've served their country. Obviously, this is a little personal to me as a veteran, but they have served their country and somehow do not have the supports necessary to have a stable place to live. So we're working to say, what kind of community and neighborhood can we create embedded in a greater neighborhood with protections for both, but that isn't exclusionary. So that's how I got on this gig, right? And then it opens doors for our students, for our faculty, for our staff to be part of that solution. And to me, you know, because we're using the word scholarship, it can be traditional research that's gathering data, whether that's qualitative or quantitative, and getting published in a peer-reviewed journal. It could be something that is about qualitative, where we write a article for some non-academic publication that is here in Edmonton. That could be the Edmonton Journal, it could be for a magazine, it could be for anything, to bring to light these experiences and the value we're bringing as scholars to understand, here's some ways to begin to address these issues, right? So that's what it is for me. I'd like to hear from our AVP research, because clearly this is in his wheelhouse as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think you actually summarized it quite well, Wanda. Like, I mean, I don't think there's any one definition for community engaged scholarship. I think it's really more important that the words have meaning. So when you talk about, okay, if you dissect it, you've got community. Community can mean a lot of things. We work with for-profits, not-for-profits, government organizations. That's really our community. And as you said, MacEwan is in a unique location in that we've got the Ice District to the south of us. We've got lower socioeconomic neighborhoods to the north of us. That's all our community. Like that really is kind of the border, the boundaries of who MacEwan is. And we're right in the middle of that. We're kind of the heart of those communities. But I think the engage part is also important. That's kind of what I was talking about earlier, in that it's got to be an active two-way conversation. Like, it's not us producing research that we're then piloting on a community group. They have to actually be part of the development of it, and they have to be part of the refinement of it. And I think it's really that two-way exchange is probably the thing I think is most important in any, whether you're calling it community engaged or community participatory or whatever. I think that two-way direction is probably the most important thing.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, I don't see any other questions coming up. I'm sure if anybody has any, I can always forward them to Dr. Costen. I'm sure she'd be happy to answer them while she's trying to plan her move to Queens to take over as the Dean of Business at the Smith School of Business out there. Dr. Costen, thank you very much for the presentation and conversation. I think it was a wonderful way to end our scholarly presentations, and a good conversation about community engagement and opportunities, and how do we make sure MacEwan doesn't rest on our laurels as a community engaged institution, but rather we have to keep building that up. I mean, it's kind of a responsibility, and I think a title of pride for us, and we have to wear it proudly, but we also have to keep earning it.
Yeah, I would agree. And I want to reiterate again, anytime I did so appreciate Catherine's question. Anytime anyone's got a question about how I've done this myself both as a faculty member and now as a dean, on behalf of my faculty colleagues to provide opportunities for them for funding and engagement. I'm happy to talk and chat about what you do and how what kinds of opportunities might be out there to advance your particular type of scholarship and research.
So thank you everybody for attending, and just a reminder that on Monday is our Student Research Day, so we will have live presentations throughout the day, but the nice thing about being virtual is the presentations will also be available all week long. So if you miss any of the live presentations on Monday and you look in the program and say, oh, I really wanted to see this fac student talk about their project, or wanted to see the biology student talking about their project, you can always watch the posters or the oral presentations throughout the week. So I hope everybody has a nice afternoon. It looks like decent weather, and please have an enjoyable weekend. Stay safe, everyone.